Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. This lecture we're going to talk about DDoS or Distributed Denial of Service. So this actual lecture is based off the AWS DDoS white paper. It was last updated in 2016. They tend to update it every year, so I would expect it to be updated sometime around reInvent or in Q1 of next year. One thing to bear in mind is that it doesn't mention AWS Shield anywhere throughout the white paper because they hadn't really productized it when this white paper was written. So I do have a little extra section at the end which will cover Shield. We have sort of covered Shield in a little bit of depth, but not a lot. So we will cover that off at the end of this lecture. I'm actually really fond of this white paper. My very first job as an AWS solutions architect was to take this white paper when it was first published, read through it, and then go in and evaluate an enterprise customer's environment and see what the gaps were. Were they basically going, following all the best practices in this white paper? So I do know it really well. It is definitely worth reading this white paper before you go in and do your exam. It will really prepare you for all the DDoS questions that you're going to get. So what is a DDoS attack? I'm sure you all know what it is already, but it stands for a distributed denial of service attack, and it's an attack that attempts to make your websites or applications unavailable to your end users. This can be achieved by a whole bunch of multiple different mechanisms, such as packet floods, by using a combination of reflection and amplification techniques, or by using large botnets. And it's actually the way I first started getting interested in, the dark web and Tor and all of that. I was actually doing a master's in computer science in security. And I read about how you could just go onto the dark web and just basically rent Russian botnets. And the Silk Road used to have these. Used to be able to go and basically, go buy Bitcoin and then pay for these, botnets to go in and attack people. It was like fascinating stuff. So there is definitely a dark side to internet culture. But thankfully, with DDoS mitigation, AWS gives us a lot of tools to prevent DDoS attacks, much more than I would argue any other cloud provider. So let's talk about a couple of different attacks. So we've got amplification and reflection attacks, and this is things like NTP or SSDP or DNS or Trojan or SNMP attacks. And it's where an attacker basically sends a third-party server, such as an NTP server, a request using a spoofed IP address, and that server then responds to that request with a greater payload than the initial request. And usually we're talking in the regions of 28 to 54 times larger than the request of the spoofed address. So this means the attacker sends a packet with a spoofed IP address of about 64 bytes. The NTP server would then respond with up to 3,456 bytes of traffic. So you basically, are amplifying, or you're both amplifying and reflecting an attack because you're spoofing the IP address of the victim that you want to, to receive all this traffic. And then attackers can coordinate this and use multiple NTP servers a second to send legitimate NTP traffic to the target. Okay, so let's have a look at how this works. So we've got our hacker, we've got the hacker's real IP address, which is 190.1.2.3. Then they're targeting a particular victim, and they know the victim's IP address, it's 245.1.2.3. So what they do is they go out and identify a whole bunch of NTP servers. It's not normally one, it will be a whole bunch. And essentially what they'll do is they'll go and send a packet or a spoof. And essentially what they'll do is they'll spoof their IP address to be the victim's IP address rather than their real IP address and send that on to these NTP servers. And so if you're sending on a 64-byte payload, you can actually get the NTP server to send back a whole bunch of information by doing the right request. And it's going to send back something like 3,456 bytes. Now, when you do this at scale with multiple NTP servers all over the world, essentially what you're going to do is basically overwhelm your victim's server, and they're going to have an outage. Let's talk about some other application attacks, so layer 7 attacks. Another one's where we've got our attacker, we've got a web server, and it's pretty traditional attack. You just send to the web server a flood of GET requests. That can easily be detected and prevented using a whole bunch of different software. But some of the more effective attacks are things like a slow Loris attack. So the way a slow loris attacks, it works by basically opening multiple connections to the targeted web server, and you want to keep them open as long as possible. And it does this by basically continuously sending partial HTTP requests, none of which are ever actually completed. And so the attack server opens up more and more connections, basically waiting for these requests to be completed. And of course, they never are. And this goes on, ultimately until the server's maximum concurrent connection pool gets filled. And then after that, when our user tries to connect in, a real world user, they won't be able to because the pool is full. Now, what's clever about this is that slow lorises basically can easily slip by traditional intrusion detection systems. So there are many, many, many different types of DDoS attacks. I'm not going to cover them all in this lecture because you're not going to be tested on them, but what you are expected to know is how to mitigate DDoS attacks. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of different points, but we'll start with minimizing the attack surface area. You should be ready to scale to absorb the attack. You should safeguard and your exposed resources. You should learn what normal behavior looks like, and then you should create a plan for attacks. So let's start with minimize the attack surface area. So some production environments have multiple entry points into them. Perhaps they allow in SSH or RDP access to their web servers or application servers or database servers for management. And this can give you a very wide number of servers that you have to go in and harden and protect and make sure that the operating systems are kept up to date. And it can be a bit of an administrative nightmare. The best practice is to use a bastion or jump box, which we've talked about quite a bit in the VPC section of the course, and that only allows access to specific white-listed IP addresses to the Bastion server, and then you move your web applications and your application servers and database servers to private subnets, and they're only accessible via this Bastion or jump box, and of course, only white-listed IP addresses can get into this Bastion or jump box, and then all you have to worry about is basically, hardening that Bastion and jump box and making it as secure as possible. Maybe you want to use the Center for Internet Security's, hardened OS that we saw in the AWS Marketplace for that Bastion or jump box. And by minimizing the attack surface area, basically you're limiting your exposure to just a few hardened entry points. So let's have a look at what this looks like in real life. So again, we've got our administrators, we've got our users, and we've got our internet connection. We've got services like S3, CloudFront, Route 53 that don't require any sort of administrating. Then we've got in here, we've got our SSH or our Bastion jump box. And what happens is our administrators basically connect into this Bastion, and then they are able to route through this Bastion and connect into things like our web server or to connect into things like our MySQL server. They're going in through this secure connection. Our normal users are basically, the requests are first hitting our cloud distributed services like S3, CloudFront, Route 53, etc., and then going through an Elastic load balancer, which is protected by a web application firewall. And of course, Elastic load balancers, by that I basically mean application load balancers. They've just changed the terminology, but you understand what I mean. And then that's also all monitored, by CloudWatch, and it's also protected by an auto-scaling group. So if we start getting a large number of requests, we can actually scale to that, assuming, of course, the WAF lets it through. So moving on, we're going to talk about be ready to scale to absorb the attack. So the key strategy behind a DDoS attack is to bring your infrastructure to breaking point, and the strategy assumes one thing, that you can't scale to meet the attack. Now, of course, the easiest way to defeat this strategy is to design your infrastructure to scale as and when it's needed, and you can both scale both horizontally and vertically. And I remember there were people trying to DDoS Amazon.com, and of course they couldn't because it's behind AWS. It was literally impossible. I remember reading about that in I think it was around 2010 when somebody anonymous were attacking PayPal, and then they decided to go in and attack Amazon, but of course you couldn't because it was behind AWS. So scaling has the following benefits. It's spread over a larger area in terms of the attack. Attackers have to counter the attack, which takes up more of their resources. Scaling buys you time to analyze the attack and respond with the appropriate countermeasures. And then scaling has the added benefit of providing you with additional levels of redundancy as well. So it's not just a good practice in terms of security, but it's also good practice just in terms of general availability. Moving on, we should safeguard our exposed resources. So in situations where you cannot eliminate internet entry points to your applications, you'll need to take additional measures to restrict access and to protect those entry points without interrupting legitimate end user traffic. So there are basically three resources that can provide this control and flexibility. So CloudFront, Route 53, and of course web application firewalls. So how can they do this? Well, CloudFront has geo restriction and blocking. Basically, you can go ahead and restrict to users, restrict access to users in specific countries, and you can do this using whitelist or blacklist. So seriously, do you really want North Korea, being able to access your website? It might be a good idea if you're Sony Pictures and you're using a CloudFront distribution to block all North Korean traffic. Now, I know, of course, people can use VPNs and get around it, but that is a good starting point. You can also use Origin Access Identity to restrict access to your S3 bucket, so that only people can access the S3 using CloudFront URLs. With Route 53, we've got alias record sets, and you can use these to immediately redirect your traffic to CloudFront distributions, or to different ELB load balancers with a higher capacity EC2 instances running behind WAFs, or your own security tools. Cool thing about this is you don't need any DNS changes and you don't need to worry about propagation. And of course, you can use private DNS, and this allows you to manage internal DNS names for your application resources, so web servers, application servers, database servers, etc., without exposing this information to the public internet. And then finally, we've got WAFs. So DDoS attacks happen at the application layer, commonly targeting web applications with lower volumes of traffic compared to infrastructure attacks. To mitigate against these attacks, you should use a WAF as a part of your infrastructure. So you can use the new WAF service. It's relatively new. It's just over 12 months old. So you can use WAF to protect your EC2 instances, as well as your application load balancers, as well as your CloudFront distributions, as well as you can also go and buy third-party web application firewalls using the AWS Marketplace. Next up, we had learn normal behavior. And the reason you should learn normal behavior is because then you can identify what's abnormal. So you should know the different types of traffic and what normal levels of this traffic should be. And you should also understand expected and unexpected resource spikes, definitely can occur. And then once you've learned what normal behavior is, you can basically learn to spot abnormalities very, very fast. And you can create an alarm to alert you of abnormal behavior. And this basically helps you to collect forensic data to understand the attack, because you can compare what's normal to what's abnormal. And then you can basically diagnose how this attack is occurring. And then you can figure out a strategy in terms of how to prevent it, which brings us on to create a plan for attacks. So having a plan in place before an attack ensures that you've validated the design of your architecture, you understand the costs You understand the cost for your increased resiliency, and you already know what techniques to employ when you come under attack. You also know who to contact when an attack happens. And that kind of brings us on to AWS Shield. So AWS Shield is a free service that protects all AWS customers on Elastic Load Balancers, CloudFront, and Route 53. And it protects against SYN, UDP floods, reflection attacks, and other Layer 3 or Layer 4 attacks. If you want Layer 7 protection, of course, you're going to use things like WAF, but Shield is primarily designed for Layer 3 and Layer 4 attacks. And then you have Shield Advanced, and Advanced provides enhanced protection for your applications running on Elastic Load Balancers, CloudFront, and Route 53 against larger and more sophisticated attacks. And of course, it's $3,000 per month, which for a big enterprise is basically nothing. So what does Shield actually give you? Well, it's always on flow-based monitoring of network traffic and active application monitoring to provide you with near real-time notifications of a DDoS attack. You also get access to the DDoS response team, who are there 24/7 to manage and help you mitigate your application layer DDoS attacks. And then it also protects your AWS bill against higher fees due to Elastic Load Balancing, CloudFront, and Route 53 usage spikes during a DDoS attack. So for every Fortune 500 company, I definitely would go out and get Shield. Also, if you're spending $15,000 a month for enterprise support, you'd be insane not to get Shield as well. So that I definitely look at AWS Shield. They're adding more and more capabilities to it all the time. So what are my DDoS exam tips? Well, it's definitely worth a few points in the exam. Go ahead and read that white paper. It is a seriously good white paper, very, very interesting. We have covered all the main points in that white paper, but they do go into a lot more detail than what I did. And just remember the technologies that you can use to mitigate a DDoS attack. So you can use CloudFront, you can use Route 53, you can use your application load balancers, you can use your web application firewalls, you can use auto scaling, and you can use things like CloudWatch as well. And like I said, go read this white paper. It's actually really interesting. I know a lot of AWS white papers can be a bit dry and dull, but the DDoS white papers are actually really good white paper to read. So that's it from me, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture, which is on compliance.